Have you ever wondered how a land of endless forests and silent rivers became one of the most powerful nations on Earth? Tonight, we'll begin a long, slow journey through the calm echoes of time to uncover the soft, whispering story of the United States of America. Not the loud one told in textbooks or movies, but the quiet version, the one that drifts like wind across centuries. Before the Stars and Stripes. Before America was America, before the word itself meant anything, there was only the land, vast, untamed, and ancient. It was a world of quiet rhythms, the crackle of fires in the deep woods, the whisper of rivers carving valleys, the songs of birds drifting across endless plains. For more than 10,000 years, this land was home to countless nations, the indigenous peoples of North America. They had no single flag, no borders drawn with ink, but they knew every curve of the rivers, every mountain shadow, every star that guided them. In the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built cities of stone that clung to canyon walls. In the Great Plains, the Lakota followed the roaming buffalo herds beneath wide skies. Farther east, the Iroquois built longhouses and councils that would one day inspire the very concept of American democracy. There was balance between people and earth, spirit and survival. When Europeans finally arrived, they did not step into wilderness. They stepped into a continent already alive with civilization. The arrival. It began quietly in the late 1400s. Sails on the horizon, strange ships cutting across the Atlantic. Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, believing he'd found a new route to Asia. He hadn't. But what he found changed everything. Soon, explorers from Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands followed, each driven by dreams of gold, glory, and God. The Spanish came first, their conquistadors carving empires through Mexico and Florida. French traders drifted down the Mississippi, leaving trails of fur and faith. But it was the English, with their colonies on the Atlantic coast, who quietly laid the foundations of what would become a new nation. In 1607, a small group of weary settlers landed in Virginia and founded Jamestown. The air was heavy, the marshes thick with insects, and the soil refused to yield. They nearly starved. Half of them died in the first year, yet somehow they endured. 17 years later, in 1620, another small ship crossed the ocean, the Mayflower, carrying pilgrims searching for religious freedom. They landed in the cold, gray shores of Massachusetts, built a settlement called Plymouth, and gave thanks simply for survival. Their story would become legend, a tale of courage, struggle, and the hope of a fresh start. By the 1700s, 13 colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast. They were British in name, but different in spirit. The people who lived there were farmers, craftsmen, and dreamers, bound by hard work, weather, and a growing sense that they were something new. They traded tea and tobacco, built wooden towns, and debated God and government by candlelight. But far away, in London, a distant king taxed their goods, ruled their laws, and treated them like subjects instead of citizens. Whispers of independence began, quiet at first, then louder. In taverns and meeting halls, names like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin began to rise. They spoke not of rebellion, but of liberty, of a world where ordinary people might govern themselves. It was a dangerous dream, and in time, it would set the world on fire. The Revolution's Whisper. The spark came in 1775 in a small town called Lexington. No one remembers who fired the first shot, but it echoed across history, the shot heard around the world. Farmers and blacksmiths stood against red-coated soldiers of the mightiest empire on earth. They were outnumbered, out-trained, and out-armed, yet they fought with something stronger: belief. For 8 long years, the colonies bled and burned. Battles raged across valleys and frozen rivers. Washington led his men through snow and starvation, refusing to surrender even when hope seemed lost. Then, in 1781, against all odds, the impossible happened. At Yorktown, Virginia, the British surrendered. And 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris made it official. The United States of America was born. But even as fireworks filled the sky, a question lingered in the silence. What did freedom truly mean? The birth of a fragile dream. The new nation was fragile, stitched together by ideals and uncertainty. The founding fathers met in Philadelphia to create something the world had never seen: a government of the people, by the people, for the people. In 1787, they wrote the Constitution, a document both brilliant and flawed. It promised liberty, but allowed slavery, preached equality, but excluded women and the poor. Still, it was a beginning, and like all beginnings, it carried hope. George Washington, the reluctant hero, became the first president in 1789. He set a tone of restraint and dignity, reminding the young nation that power must always bow to principle. For a moment, America seemed at peace. Westward shadows. But peace is never still for long. As years passed, settlers began moving west, across forests, rivers, and mountains, driven by hunger for land and legend. They called it manifest destiny, the belief that America was meant to expand from ocean to ocean. But every mile gained came with a cost. Native nations were pushed, displaced, or destroyed. Entire cultures vanished beneath the weight of progress. And yet the dream of America, vast, open, and new, kept spreading. The growing divide. By the early 1800s, 2 Americas had begun to form. In the North, cities grew, factories roared, and ideas of free labor took root. In the South, cotton ruled, and with it came slavery, the dark contradiction at the heart of freedom. Politicians tried to balance the scales, to hold together a union built on unequal ground. But whispers of conflict grew, and deep down, everyone knew a storm was coming. As we end this first part of our long, sleepy journey through America's past, imagine the flicker of candlelight in an 18th century home, a quill scratching across parchment, and a dream, fragile, imperfect, but alive. Tomorrow, we'll continue from the dawn of the 19th century to the thunder of civil war. For now, let the quiet rhythms of history fade into rest. Good night, and let the story of America drift softly through your dreams. When we last left our quiet journey, the United States was still young, a fragile dream held together by hope, paper, and the courage of men who believed in liberty. But beneath the calm surface, dark currents were stirring. The 19th century was dawning, and with it came both promise and peril. The age of division and the storm of the Civil War. The new century began with expansion. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson made a bold move that would forever change the map: the Louisiana Purchase. For just $15 million, the United States bought a stretch of land so vast it doubled the nation overnight. Mountains, plains, rivers, all the way to the shining Pacific, were now within reach. Explorers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark set out to chart the unknown. They walked for months through forests no European had ever seen, crossed wild rivers, and gazed upon endless prairies where buffalo roamed by the millions. Their journals spoke of wonder and of a land that seemed to have no end. But expansion came with a shadow. For every mile westward, indigenous nations were pushed further from their homes. Treaties were made, then broken. By the 1830s, the U.S. government forced thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands in the Southeast. They marched west, through rain and snow, many never reaching the end. History remembers it as the Trail of Tears, a phrase as soft as it is sorrowful. The divided house and the storm of the Civil War. While the frontier expanded, the nation's soul was splitting in two. In the north, cities rose and factories thundered. Immigrants from Ireland and Germany arrived, filling streets with new voices, new hopes. In the south, cotton plantations spread, built upon the labor of enslaved Africans. Slavery had been part of the American story since its earliest days, but now it had become a moral wound too deep to ignore. Abolitionists in the North spoke of justice and equality. Slaveholders in the South spoke of rights and tradition. Congress argued, tempers flared, and compromise after compromise failed to hold the nation together. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that captured the cruelty of slavery in vivid detail. It spread like wildfire, stirring empathy and anger across the North. The South denounced it as lies, but a change had begun, slow, unstoppable, and dangerous. The Spark of War. The year 1860 brought a tall, quiet man from Illinois into history, Abraham Lincoln. He spoke with calm conviction, promising to stop the spread of slavery, not to end it everywhere, but to keep it from growing. To many in the South, even that was too much. In December 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. Then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. By early January 1861, 11 states had formed their own nation, the Confederate States of America. And soon after, the guns fired at Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. The War Between Brothers. For 4 terrible years, America fought itself. Fields turned into graves and cities burned. At first, the South seemed unstoppable. Their generals, like Robert E. Lee, were brilliant tacticians, and their soldiers fought for their homes. But the North had industry, numbers, and time.
Lincoln watched the nation tear itself apart and struggled with an impossible burden: how to save a union that no longer wanted saving. In 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate territory to be free. It was not the end of slavery yet, but it changed the meaning of the war. Now the fight was no longer just for union, it was for freedom itself. The battles were endless: Antietam, Gettysburg, Shiloh, Vicksburg. The fields drank the blood of thousands. At Gettysburg, Lincoln later stood before the graves and spoke only 272 words, the Gettysburg Address, a quiet, eternal reminder that the dead had not died in vain. The end of the war and of innocence. In 1865, the South collapsed. Richmond burned. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, and the Civil War came to an end. The Union had survived, but at a cost so high it could never truly be counted. More than 600,000 lives were gone, and an entire generation was marked by grief. Days later, as the country began to breathe again, tragedy struck once more. Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, a final echo of hatred in a nation already broken. Lincoln's body was carried through silent crowds, his coffin draped in black. The man who had kept the Union together was gone, leaving behind a question: what kind of America would rise from the ashes? Reconstruction, hope, and betrayal. After the war, the United States faced a new challenge: rebuilding not just the South, but the soul of the nation. For a time, there was hope. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th granted citizenship to those once enslaved. The 15th gave them the right to vote. For a moment, freedom seemed real. Black men were elected to Congress. Schools were built. The promise of equality flickered like dawn after a long night. But the light didn't last. Resistance in the South grew fierce. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan arose from the ruins, spreading fear and violence. Northern politicians, weary of the struggle, turned their eyes away. By the late 1870s, Reconstruction was over, and the South returned to its old ways, hiding injustice beneath new laws. The Gilded Age. The country turned its attention to progress, to steel, steam, and sky. Railroads crossed the continent. Cities rose higher every year. Immigrants poured in from Europe and Asia, filling factories and building the nation's backbone. But behind the shining facades, poverty and corruption festered. It was called the Gilded Age, golden on the outside, tarnished beneath. Still, the people dreamed on. The Statue of Liberty rose over New York Harbor in 1886, a gift from France, its torch promising freedom to the world. And the closing of the frontier. By the 1890s, the frontier, that wild dream of endless land, was gone. The last buffalo herds were slaughtered, the Great Plains fenced, and the West declared settled. Native Americans were confined to reservations. The old ways of the continent faded like footprints in dust. And yet, America stood taller than ever, restless, ambitious, unsure of what came next. A new century was approaching, filled with invention and promise, but haunted by the ghosts of what had been lost. As this second chapter of our slow, sleepy journey closes, picture a flickering oil lamp in a farmhouse window, a nation weary but still awake, and a quiet whisper carried by the wind that freedom, like the land itself, was still being shaped. Rest now, and when we wake again, we'll drift into the 20th century, a time of machines, wars, dreams, and destiny.
The night deepens as we return to our quiet story, the long, gentle dream of a nation that never stops changing. When we left America, it had crossed the plains, built cities of iron and glass, and stood on the edge of a new century. The air smelled of coal and promise. The year was 1900, and the world was holding its breath. The century of change. The dawn of the 20th century arrived with hum and smoke. Factories roared, railroads crisscrossed the country, and the first automobiles rattled down dusty streets. Inventions were reshaping life itself. Telephones, light bulbs, airplanes, motion pictures. For the first time, ordinary people could see themselves in moving images, hear distant voices, and dream of flight. But progress, like history, is never simple. The same machines that made fortunes also swallowed lives. Children worked in mills. Women fought for the right to vote. Cities grew too fast, crowded, chaotic, alive. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City took the lives of 146 workers, most of them young immigrant women. The tragedy sparked outrage, and slowly, laws began to change. It was a time of contradictions, greed and compassion, innovation and inequality, hope and hardship. The Great War. In 1914, far across the ocean, the world caught fire. Nations of Europe fell into conflict, a war so vast it was called the Great War. At first, America stayed silent, watching as millions marched to trenches. But the distance between continents shrank with every telegram, every ship sunk in the Atlantic. In 1917, the United States entered the war. Young men crossed the sea to fight in muddy fields of France, beneath skies blackened by smoke and gas. They fought for democracy, they said, for peace, for an end to empire. But when the guns finally stopped in 1918, the world was forever changed. Empires fell, millions were dead, and America, once a young nation on the edge of the world, found itself standing in the center of it. The soldiers came home with medals and nightmares. The 1920s arrived like a breath of relief and excess. The Roaring Twenties. Jazz filled the streets. Cities glowed with neon and laughter. Women danced in shorter skirts. Men drove shiny cars, and money seemed endless. It was the age of the flapper, of bootleg whiskey, of dreams written in electric lights. But behind the music, shadows gathered. The rich grew richer, the poor stayed poor, and the stock market climbed higher than ever, until one day it fell. The Great Depression. October 1929. The stock market crashed. Banks collapsed, factories closed, and millions lost their jobs overnight. Men who had once worn suits now stood in bread lines. Children went to bed hungry. Farms turned to dust under the scorching sun. It was the Great Depression, a decade of despair. And yet, amid the darkness, something remarkable happened. The country did not give up. In 1933, a new president took office, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. With calm voice and quiet strength, he told the nation, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Through his New Deal programs, he created jobs, built dams, planted forests, and gave hope to a weary people. For the first time, the government became a hand to hold, imperfect but human. Families gathered around radios at night, listening to Roosevelt's fireside chats. His words were steady, like a father reassuring his children that the storm would pass. But the storm did not end. It grew. In 1939, war once again erupted in Europe, and this time it was darker than before. Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, sought to conquer the world. Millions were imprisoned, tortured, and killed, especially Jews, in what the world would come to call the Holocaust. At first, America watched again from across the ocean. Then, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The sound of bombs awakened the nation. America entered World War II, a war that would define the century. Factories roared back to life, building planes, ships, and weapons faster than ever before. Men fought in Europe and the Pacific. Women worked in factories as Rosie the Riveter, keeping the country moving. The nation united, every resource, every heart focused on one goal: victory. As the war ended in 1945, with both triumph and terror, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the war in Japan, but unleashing a power so destructive that the world would never be the same. As peace returned, America stood tall, powerful, proud, and uneasy. The Cold War began. The victory left two giants facing each other across a divided world, the United States and the Soviet Union. One stood for democracy and capitalism, the other for communism and control. Their weapons could destroy the world, and yet for decades they never fired them, choosing instead to fight with spies, satellites, and words. This was the Cold War, a war of ideas, fear, and endless tension. Children practiced hiding under desks. Movies imagined nuclear doom. And above it all, rockets began to reach for the stars. In 1961, an American president, young, confident John F. Kennedy, promised that before the decade was out, America would land a man on the moon. And in 1969, it happened. Neil Armstrong's voice crackled through the static. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. For a brief, shining moment, the whole world looked up together. The struggle within. But even as America reached the stars, it faced its oldest shadows at home. The fight for civil rights had begun. In the 1950s and 60s, Black Americans marched, sang, and suffered for equality. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. preached peace, even in the face of hatred. His voice echoed from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. "I have a dream that one day the nation would finally live up to its own promise." There were riots and resistance, heartbreak and hope. And though laws changed, ending segregation, protecting the right to vote, the struggle for justice remained unfinished. At the same time, young people questioned everything: war, authority, tradition. The Vietnam War divided the country, and the 1960s burned with protest, music, and revolution. The Beatles played, the counterculture bloomed, and America seemed to teeter between chaos and creation. The end of an era. By the 1970s, the country was weary. The Vietnam War ended in sorrow.
President Nixon resigned after the Watergate scandal, the first U.S. president to do so. And yet, amid cynicism, new voices emerged, calling for environmental care, women's rights, and equality for all. Technology advanced again. Computers hummed, satellites orbited, and a new kind of power began to rise: information. As this third chapter closes, imagine America standing beneath a vast night sky, its stars reflected in glass towers and glowing television screens. The nation had survived wars, depressions, and upheaval, and yet it still searched for meaning. In our final part, we'll drift into the modern age, from the digital dawn to the world we live in today. So close your eyes, breathe, and let the quiet hum of history carry you toward the present.
The story continues, softly now, into the age of screens, sound, and silent revolutions. The century was turning again, and the United States was no longer a young dream. It was an idea made real, imperfect, and alive. The digital dawn. The 1980s began with neon lights and restless energy. Cold War tensions still lingered. Two superpowers staring across oceans, fingers near buttons that could end the world. Yet, even as missiles waited, the world found new rhythms. Music grew louder, colors brighter, and technology smaller. Computers crept into offices, then homes, then pockets. A few quiet minds in Silicon Valley began to shape the future. Apple, Microsoft, IBM. Names that would soon echo everywhere. Children played pixelated games, adults learned to type. The world was connecting, bit by bit, long before anyone truly understood what that would mean. The fall of the wall. Then, in 1989, a miracle of silence and celebration. Berlin. A wall that had divided East and West for decades crumbled under hammers and tears. The Cold War ended not with an explosion, but with music, dancing, and open arms. America watched, proud and relieved. It had outlasted its rival. The Soviet Union dissolved, and democracy seemed to have triumphed. For a brief time, the world felt simpler. But history never sleeps for long. The 1990s. The world goes online. The 1990s shimmered with optimism. Grunge and pop, MTV and cable news, culture spread faster than ever before. And then came the internet, a quiet invention that would change everything. At first it was slow, the screech of dial-up modems, the patience of waiting for a page to load. But soon information flowed freely across the world. Email replaced letters, websites replaced libraries. A new global village was born. America led this digital revolution, building the software, the servers, the dream of endless connection. It felt like the future had finally arrived. And then, on a clear blue morning in September 2001, the world changed again. Terrorists hijacked airplanes and struck the heart of America, the Twin Towers in New York, the Pentagon in Washington, and a field in Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives. The nation grieved together, stunned, silent, unified in sorrow. Flags hung from every porch, voices trembled on every news broadcast, and the United States entered a new kind of war, one without clear borders or end. The years that followed were filled with conflict abroad and fear at home. Iraq, Afghanistan, security checks at airports. A generation grew up under the shadow of the War on Terror. But through the grief, the country kept going, because that's what it always does.